Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. We have completed the first chapter of the part 1, the Yoga of Divine Works, the chapter called the Four Eights. Now we are moving on to the second chapter, Self-Consecration. Self-consecration is the central movement of yoga. Very beautiful chapter. Let's get started. The description link below will have the link to this particular chapter. Those who are not familiar, please look at that link and try to follow the text while we are exploring it. I'm starting with the paragraph number 1. Self-consecration. All yoga is in its nature a new birth. It is a birth out of the ordinary, the mentalized material life of man, into a higher spiritual consciousness and a greater and diviner being. Our normal existence is what he is referring to as a mentalized material life of man. We have this material life which is mentalized. We are mental beings. We know everything, explore everything through the mind. Mind is our center. And we are a mentalized being or mentalized material life of man. That is what we are in. So whereas yoga is demanding us to rise to a whole new level of being, shift the very center of our being from mentalized life to a diviner spiritual life. And that life is almost like a rebirth. Elsewhere in the earlier chapters, Sri Aurobindo referred to as the Dvija, the twice born. So all yoga in general, all schools of yoga, they all attempt the same in terms of shifting the center from this mentalized material life to a spiritual existence. Where they differ, and particularly integral yoga it is not only shifting to that higher center, but also bringing that into this life, into this material life, and transforming it and divinizing it. First is coming in touch with that diviner existence and then bringing that into this life. All yoga is in its nature a new birth. It is a birth out of the ordinary, the mentalized material life of man, into a higher spiritual consciousness and a greater and diviner being. No yoga can be successfully undertaken and followed unless there is a strong awakening to the necessity of that larger spiritual existence. This is the central need. We have to strongly feel the necessity of that larger spiritual existence to shift from our ordinary life to that larger spiritual existence. That necessity, when it becomes imperative, that becomes the central motive, then yoga becomes your life. No yoga can be successfully undertaken. So success of yoga depends upon this central necessity in your being to shift into that larger spiritual existence. No yoga can be successfully undertaken and followed unless there is a strong awakening We have to awaken to that possibility. We are in a kind of a sleep mode, semi-awake. From there towards a strong awakening to the necessity of that larger spiritual existence. The soul that is called to this deep and vast inward change may arrive in different ways to the initial departure. There are millions and millions of souls on earth. Out of that, some are called. And each one will have a point of departure from their ordinary life to a yogic pursuit. And a pursuit that will be leading to a vast change, a very deep inner change. The soul that is called to this deep and vast inward change, fundamentally it is an inward change which will eventually reflect in the outer life. The soul that is called to this deep and vast inward change may arrive in different ways to the initial departure. Each one will have their different way of arriving at this departure into this higher possibility. It may come to it by its own natural development. We have our natural development, which has been leading it unconsciously towards the awakening. This leading had been happening, but unconsciously. So that natural development, unconsciously developing, had been quietly leading us, all the souls, towards this necessity and this awakening. It may reach it through the influence of a religion. That is one of the common ways it happens. An influence from one or other religion, or the attraction of a philosophy. You get drawn to various philosophies regarding life, purpose of life, philosophy that ask deep questions and give you a perspective, the possibility of a higher spiritual existence. So getting drawn to some such philosophy could be a point of departure. Or the attraction of a philosophy. It may approach it by a slow illumination. Slow illumination. We are getting little sparks of insight and getting illumined towards that possibility. Or a leap to it by a sudden touch or a shock. That's another way. Instead of having a slow, steady build up, it could be a leap into that possibility through a sudden shock, a sudden touch or a shock. Or it may be pushed or led to it by the pressure of outward circumstances. That's another way we arrive at. Life creates situations that will force us to think, rethink, reflect upon the very purpose of life. Very shocking incidents of life can do that. And it builds up the pressure to reflect, rethink, and make that transition. Or by an inward necessity. So you need not have any external pressure, a shock, nothing, but it can come from an inward necessity, something that is driving you from inside. By a single word that breaks the seal of the mind. That's another possibility. You hear something from someone or some book that triggers, that opens the seal of the mind, that breaks the seal of the mind, or by long reflection. So you may read, you may study, and there is a continuous reflection on it for a long period of time, then you make the departure. By the distant example of one who has trod the path. That's another way. an example of someone who has walked the path that is inspiring you. You come to know about someone who did it and you find it fascinating. What made this person do this? What was this person up to? A fascination of someone, or by contact and daily influence. Of course, when you're in touch with someone who is on the path, that infusion naturally happens through that contact and daily influence. You begin to develop this necessity to shift into that higher possibility of our existence. So let me read that full line. It may come to it by its own natural development, which has been leading it unconsciously towards the awakening. It may reach it through the influence of a religion or the attraction of a philosophy. It may approach it by a slow illumination or leap to it by a sudden touch or shock. It may be pushed or led to it by the pressure of outward circumstances, or by an inward necessity, by a single word that breaks the seal of the mind, or by long reflection, by the distant example of one who has trod the path, or by contact and daily influence. This is one of the most fascinating thing about Sri Aurobindo. He gives a whole spectrum of possibilities. It's not just one way of arriving at. Each person will find their own way, and Sri Aurobindo gives a wide range of possibilities and a spectrum. According to the nature and the circumstances, the call will come. The soul is asleep in life, this mentalized material life in which you are immersed and absorbed, and according to the nature and circumstances, the call will come. The call to the soul that is sleeping to wake up and begin the pursuit. So each one of us will be receiving the call in our own unique ways. And Sri Aurobindo gave a spectrum out of which one or more will come into picture, come into play, and you gradually wake up, or some suddenly wakes up. Whatever be the way, the call will come according to the circumstances and the nature of the soul. But in whatever way it comes, there must be a decision of the mind and the will, and as its result, a complete and effective self-consecration. That's the theme of this chapter, self-consecration. So on one hand, there is this growing understanding, growing illumination. But at one point, there must be this decisive choice of mind and will. There must be a decision of the mind and will. Mind, through its knowledge, may arrive at an understanding. Then it makes a firm choice where the very will to act is brought in. It's not enough at a cognitive level, that volitional action level. The will itself has to be brought in. The choice of the will to pursue must be there. So, in whatever way it comes, there must be a decision of the mind and the will. And as a result, a complete and effective self-consecration. As a result of that choice is that complete self-consecration, effective self-consecration, the acceptance of a new spiritual idea force and upward orientation in the being, an illumination, a turning or conversion seized on by the will and the heart's aspiration. This is the momentous act which contains, as in a seed, all the results that the yoga has to give. That decisive turning, that decisive choice and resultant self-consecration carries with it as a seed the possibilities that yoga is offering. There is a spiritual idea force that enters. We may think that we are just reading and understanding things, but words, particularly spiritually oriented, spiritually charged words, carry certain spiritual idea force. When it comes from the masters who are living that reality, from there it comes. And that spiritual idea force gets activated within us. That is what slowly grows within as an illumination. And it brings an upward orientation of the being. The being can have a downward orientation or upward orientation or an outward orientation. The downward orientation is that tamasic degenerative movement. An outward orientation is that immersion into an external life and its demands, a sensory contact with the world and its demands, objects of the senses, our fascination with the objects of the senses, and the need to pursue them. This is externalization, outward going consciousness. What is the shift? That is the upward orientation, like a flame that ascends. That's a nature, like a plant that grows upward. There is something in the material existence that wants to ascend, that shows up as the growth of the crystal or as a flame that is ascending or a plant that is growing towards the light. Same movement takes place within us as a flame of aspiration. There is an upward orientation. The acceptance of a new spiritual idea force and upward orientation of the being, an illumination, a turning or conversion, seized on by the will and the heart's aspiration. So this is seized on. Our heart's aspiration seizes that movement and the will supports it. This is the momentous act which contains as in a seed all the results that the yoga has to give. So from that turning, it carries with it as a seed the whole potency of what is set in motion. The mere idea or intellectual seeking of something higher beyond, however strongly grasped by the mind's interest, is ineffective unless it is seized by the heart as the one thing desirable and by the will as the one thing to be done. An intellectual curiosity of reading and understanding, it has its place, but it is not enough to really set in motion the yogic force. That requires that momentous decisive choice of the will and the heart, where heart finds that this is the one thing desirable and the will makes that choice that this is the most important thing to be done. Once these two come together, the will and the heart's longing comes together, you are guaranteed to sail. Otherwise, however strong the intellectual understanding, reading, wideness of your knowledge, none of this is sufficient to really make the yogic journey. The mere idea or intellectual seeking of something higher beyond, intellectual seeking of the something higher beyond, however strongly grasped by the mind's interest, is ineffective unless it is seized on by the heart as the one thing desirable and by the will as the one thing to be done. For truth of the Spirit has not to be merely thought but to be lived. And to live it demands a unified single-mindedness of the being. So great a change as is contemplated by the yoga is not to be effected by a divided will or by a small portion of the energy or by a hesitating mind. Our entire being is required to make that journey. So these are the possibilities. A divided will. A part may have decided, other parts are not. Therefore, the will gets decided. A small portion of the energy is ready to give itself, but the rest may not be ready. Or a hesitating mind. A portion of the mind is ready and it is still hesitant. It is still figuring things out. So none of that are sufficient to make this leap. For truth of the Spirit has not to be merely thought, but to be lived. We can think about all the spiritual possibilities, the yogic possibilities. That is of not much use. It has to be lived. And to live it demands a unified single-mindedness of the being. Single-mindedness of the being. Usually the mind is moving from one idea to another idea. That is, this is one of the interesting philosophies. Then you have some other philosophy saying something else about life. So when you keep jumping from one thing to other, there is very little chance. It is when it becomes single-minded focus of the being. So great a change as it is contemplated by the yoga is not to be effected by a divided will or by a small portion of the energy or by a hesitating mind. He who seeks the divine must consecrate himself to God and to God only. A very well-known line from Sri Aurobindo, very powerful line from Sri Aurobindo. This is the core of it. He who seeks the divine must consecrate himself to God and to God only. Straight, clear, to the point. Let me read it again. He who seeks the divine must consecrate himself to God and God only. This cannot be a side project. It cannot be a part-time job. It is your full-time occupation, no matter what you do. And the entire being has to be consecrated. That's a condition to make yoga your life's pursuit and to succeed in that pursuit. A complete consecration. If the change comes suddenly and decisively by an overpowering influence, there is no further essential or lasting difficulty. It can happen to many that the change can come through an overpowering influence. You may come across someone who is living in that consciousness, and you have a deep resonance, and there is a deep influence that comes, or from a book even. When your inward readiness is there, there can be an overwhelming moment of an impact, a contact, and a sudden shift. If the change comes suddenly and decisively by an overpowering influence, there is no further essential lasting difficulty. If that happens, there is no lasting difficulty. Difficulties may be there, but they are not lasting, because the central movement has already been made. The choice follows upon the thought or is simultaneous with it, and the self-consecration follows upon the choice. So there is the inner choice that follows upon the thought or simultaneous with it. As the thought is finding the direction, the choice follows it, or along with the thought itself, choice arrives. Once that happens, the self-consecration follows upon the choice. So there is thought, choice, self-consecration, and they move you forward. The choice follows upon the thought or is simultaneous with it, and the self-consecration follows upon the choice. The feet are already set upon the path, even if they seem at first to wander uncertainly, and even though the path itself may be only obscurely seen, and the knowledge of the goal may be imperfect. All that are fine. The knowledge about the goal may be imperfect. The path may be seen obscurely. It doesn't matter. You may wander uncertainly. It doesn't matter. But there is a inner choice that has followed upon the thought, and there is an inner consecration that has happened. The feet are already set upon the path, even if they seem at first to wander uncertainly, and even though the path itself may be only obscurely seen, and the knowledge of the goal may be imperfect. You start off and you're fascinated by a philosophy or a religion or a teacher or a teaching, and you got a contact, and this is growing inwardly. And at one point, you realize that you have to make a decisive choice and make a leap. Even at that point, you may not clearly see the path or may not even have a clear idea about the goal. But that decisive choice do happen at one point. You know it. When you are on that critical junction, you know that you have to leave behind the ordinary life and choose something higher. And it is imperative. You don't have a choice. Even if you don't see the path clearly, even if you don't have the clarity of the goal, these things may be imperfectly seen, and that is okay. A choice is made by something within you. The feet are already set upon the path, even if they seem at first to wander uncertainly, and even though the path itself may be only obscurely seen, and the knowledge of the goal may be imperfect. The secret teacher, the inner guide, is already at work. Though he may not yet manifest himself or may not yet appear in the person of his human representative. The work is already happening. The inner guide is already working from behind the veil. And this inner guide may not have yet manifest in your life, whether it is as a representative or any other form. But behind the veil, the inner guide is at work, and your outer mind may not necessarily recognize it. You may still think that it is you who are struggling and searching and trying to find the path and walk the path. But the deeper truth is the inner guide is already at work. The earlier you recognize this inner guide who is operating from within, better it is in accelerating the path. The secret teacher, the inner guide, is already at work. Though he may not yet manifest himself or may not yet appear in the person of his human representative. You may not have found any teacher. It's all right. The inner guide is already working from behind. Whatever difficulties and hesitations may ensue, they cannot eventually prevail against the power of the experience that has turned the current of the life. Life is flowing like a river, a current, a stream of life, and it changes its direction. That happens. Whatever difficulties and hesitations may ensue, they cannot eventually prevail against the power of the experience that has turned the current of life. It's not just you read books and have some philosophical understanding. Some experience enters your life, giving you a taste, giving you the conviction. Something in your heart immediately says, yes, this is it, and makes that choice inwardly. And the course of your life begins to turn, has turned the current of the life. The call, once decisive, stands. The thing that has been born cannot eventually be stifled. So, the call stands. Once it is born within you, there is no going back. There is no return ticket. There is no safety belt either. It's like a seed waking up. There is no way the seed can go back to the sleep condition. Once awakening comes, once the call comes, once the choice is made, there is no way that is going to fail. The call, once decisive, stands. The thing that has been born cannot be eventually stifled. Even if the force of circumstances prevents a regular pursuit or a full practical self-consecration from the first, still the mind has taken its bent and persists and returns with an ever-increasing effect upon its leading preoccupation. So when you wake up to this possibility and that inner choice is made, your life circumstances may still be preventing you from a full-time pursuit. That's perfectly all right. Mind will return upon it again and again and again and again with a greater intensity, greater passion, and it become a leading preoccupation. So even if the force of circumstances prevents a regular pursuit or full practical self-consecration from the first, still the mind has taken its bent and persists and returns with an ever-increasing effect upon its leading preoccupation. There is ineluctable persistence of the inner being, and against it circumstances are in the end powerless. And no weakness in the nature can for long be an obstacle. So there is an ineluctable persistence of the inner being. We have an outer being. Behind it, there is an inner being. And this inner being will insist from within. Ineluctable insistence of this inner being. Against it, circumstances are in the end powerless. All your outer circumstances, no matter how much it stops you, blocks your progress, they are powerless. And no weakness in the nature can for long be an obstacle. In your own individual nature, no matter what weakness is there, it cannot be an obstacle. I have met a man who was crippled by polio from early childhood. And he grew up on a wheelchair. And for him, the call came. And he left home on his wheelchair. And he was traveling all over India on the wheelchair in pursuit of his inner growth. And when I met him, he had already had great inner realizations, a beautiful soul. So no matter what difficulties you have in your nature, even if your physical nature is crippled, nothing will prevent. Like the beautiful lines, Sanskrit line says, Mukam karoti vachalam. The one who is dumb will speak eloquently. Pangum lenghayate girim. The one who is lame will climb mountains. These are the lived experiences confirmed generation after generation by thousands and thousands of seekers. Once the choice is there, your inner being turns, awakens. Nothing will stop, neither the outer circumstances nor the limitations of your nature. But this is not always the manner of the commencement. So always this need not be the way. The sadhaka is often led gradually, and there is a long space between the first turning of the mind and the full ascent of the nature to the thing towards which it turns. So for most people, that is the case. There is a long period of preparation where there is turning of the mind, and then there is a full ascent of the nature. Between these two, there is a time period. So sadhaka is often led gradually, and there is a long space between the first turning of the mind, and the full ascent of the nature. The entire nature is ready to give itself. So from the first turning of the mind to the full readiness of the entire nature, there is a long preparation to the thing towards which it turns. There may at first be only a vivid intellectual interest, a forcible attraction towards the idea, and some imperfect form of practice. So usually that's how it starts. A vivid intellectual interest, an attraction towards an idea, and some imperfect form of practice. We start off one way or other. Some imperfect practice, and that's perfectly all right. That's how first it happens. Or perhaps there is an effort not favored by the whole nature, a decision or a turn imposed by an intellectual influence or dictated by personal affection and admiration for someone who is himself consecrated and devoted to the highest. So if you are in touch with someone who is already consecrated, and that attraction, that admiration, and that intellectual influence, that can turn you, but your whole nature may not be ready. Our emotional being, in particular, with all its attachments and worldly attachments or needs or ambitions, all that are still there behind the veil. So even if your mental, intellectual understanding and a fascination for someone can make that effort, or perhaps there is an effort not favored by the whole nature, a decision or a turn imposed by an intellectual influence or dictated by personal affection and admiration for someone who is himself consecrated and devoted to the highest. In such cases, a long period of preparation may be necessary before there comes an irrevocable consecration, and in some instances, it may not come. That can also happen. So, there is a long period of preparation so that your nature is eventually ready to consecrate entirely. Or it may not happen in this particular life. You got influenced, you got fascinated, but you are not yet ready to consecrate entirely your whole nature for this pursuit. And that too can happen. It could be a surface level understanding, a fascination, an attraction, an influence. But you may not be ready for that complete consecration. There may be some advance, there may be a strong effort, even much purification, and many experiences, other than those that are central or supreme. But the life will either be spent in preparation, or a certain stage having been reached, the mind, pushed by an insufficient driving force, may rest content at the limits of the effort possible to it. So you can have minor experiences, not necessarily the central experience like discovery of the psychic being or opening to that greater splendor above. Other than that, minor experiences of the sense of being guided or some impactful experiences of some illumination, all that can happen. But this need not necessarily be sufficient to make that whole scale conversion. There may be some advance, there may be some strong effort, even much purification, many experiences. You may even purify your nature, get some experiences, other than those that are central or supreme. But life will either be spent in preparation. So this particular life may be spent in preparation, and that too is not a waste. You're preparing yourself so that you may get a head start in the next birth. So you can spend this life as a preparation so that in the next life could be a potential deep consecration. So the life will be either spent in preparation or certain stage having been reached, the mind pushed by the insufficient driving force. The inner drive may be insufficient. Therefore, the mind may rest content at the limits of the effort possible to it. So we are mental beings. Our effort has a certain limit. Knowledge and will has certain limits. Unless there is that deep drive. If that is not there, then you feel content with whatever little effort, whatever progress you have made, whatever purification you have made, whatever intellectual understanding that you have made. You may not consecrate your life entirely for this pursuit. That's all right. That too happens. Or there may even be a recoil to the lower life. What is called in the ordinary parlance of yoga, a fall from the path. For some people, this too can happen. The lower nature, it yields in the beginning, but as you go deeper, there can be a recoil, a strong revolt of the lower nature for its ordinary life, its ambitions, its pursuits, its needs. And you may go back to the regular life. There may even be a recoil of the lower life, what is called in the ordinary parlance of the yoga, a fall from the path, a halfway dropping off. This lapse happens because there is a defect at the very center. When that core, your inmost core, when that is not touched, in your approach, the very center of that approach is not your deepest center of being. This can happen. And there may be some deep flaws that needs to be fixed before the pursuit can happen. Because the great wisdom, this is also guiding and knows if this person proceeds further, it can be disastrous. Because there is some flaw that needs to be corrected before you can actually make the leap. So this lapse happens because there is a defect at the very center. The intellect has been interested, the heart attracted, the will has strung itself to the effort, but the whole nature has not been taken captive by the divine. The whole nature. Our nature is complex. It has multiple layers. So the whole nature may not have been taken captive by the divine. It has only acquiesced in the interest, the attraction, or the endeavor. It has accepted, but not wholly. It has only acquiesced in the interest, the attraction, or the endeavor. The nature, the whole nature. There has been an experiment, perhaps even an eager experiment, but not a total self-giving to the imperative need of the soul or to an unforsakable ideal. One has experimented, even an eager experiment, but not a total self-giving to the imperative need of the soul or to an unforsakable ideal. The ideal that you cannot compromise, unforsakable. You cannot let it go. So there has been an experiment, perhaps even an eager experiment, but not the total self-giving to an imperative need of the soul or to an unforsakable ideal. Even such imperfect yoga has not been wasted, for no upward effort is made in vain. So naturally, we might wonder, did I waste my time? All these years of studying, and I have not been able to consecrate fully. Here is the answer. Even such imperfect yoga has not been wasted, for no upward effort is made in vain. They are all adding up. They are slowly building up. Like when you boil milk, for a long time it feels like nothing is happening. Then suddenly there's boiling that is happening. So there's a slow build up. All that effort that you put is getting added. Nothing is wasted. Even if it fails in the present or arrives only at some preparatory stage or preliminary realization, it has not yet determined the soul's future. So even if it fails in the present or arrives only at some preparatory stage or preliminary realization, it has not yet determined the soul's future. Soul's future is there. The failure doesn't define it, doesn't stop it. It is slowly building up. When the time is right, it will break through in this life or next life. But if we desire to make the most of the opportunity that life gives us, if we wish to respond adequately to the call we have received, and to attain to the goal we have glimpsed, not merely advance a little towards it, it is essential that there should be an entire self-giving. That is the condition. If we desire to make the most of the opportunity that this life gives us, we are in this life, current life, and it has given opportunity. If we really want to make use of it, the most of the opportunity, if we wish to respond adequately to the call we have received, call is reaching thousands and millions. But how many would listen to the call and make that consecration? How many would linger on the path, reading again and again this philosophy, that philosophy, not fully convinced, unsure, hesitating, will is divided, the nature is not fully ready, all that. But if we desire to make the most of the opportunity that this life gives us, if we wish to respond adequately to the call we have received and to attain to the goal we have glimpsed. We do get glimpse of the goal. The goal we have glimpsed, not merely advance a little towards it. It is essential that there should be an entire self-giving. That is necessary. You have to give yourself completely to this pursuit. The secret of success in yoga is to regard it not as one of the aims to be pursued in life, but as the one and only aim. Not as an important part of life, but as the whole of life. That's the secret of success. There is only one aim, that is realizing the divine. It is not one of the aims or one of the important aims. No. This is the whole life, nothing else. So the secret of success in yoga is to regard it not as one of the aims to be pursued in life, but as the one and the only aim. Not as an important part of life, but as the whole of life. Every other goal of life, whether it is your material goals, emotional goals, mental goals, everything is a subset. And what integral yoga offers is a wholehearted embrace of life in which everything is integrated, but the very core of the movement is this divine realization, realizing our divine possibility. Everything else is complementing, supporting, a means towards that realization. We don't have to run away from life just because this is the central focus. It is in life, in the middle of life, in the very battle of life, this transformation takes place. And that's the most beautiful promise of integral yoga. And this complete self-consecration is the decisive seed that will define, and the very intensity of this turn will define how fast your progress will be. No matter how much difficulties are there in your nature or in your surroundings, the victory is certain. If the call is there, and if you consecrate yourself to the call, if you understand there is a call and something in you deeply turns towards it, even if your path is not very clear, even if your practice is imperfect, even if you're not clear about the goal fully, but once the inner turn is there, inner decisive self-giving is there to the call, the rest will fall in place. You're bound to make progress and succeed on the path. And the secret of success in yoga is to regard it not as one of the aims to be pursued in life, but as the one and only aim, not as an important part of life, but as the whole of life. Everything is to be seen through that lens, nothing else. So with that, we come to the end of this episode. Thank you for being with me. Please do share your learnings so that others can learn from your insights, and it can be engaging for people to read your comments. See you next week. Thank you.